D-Day, a soldier's story. The roar of artillery shook the earth as Private First Class Jack Riley huddled in the landing craft, his heart pounding in his chest. He was one of thousands of Allied soldiers preparing to storm the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. As the landing craft approached the shore, Jack could see the German fortifications looming in the distance. He knew that the next few hours would be the most dangerous of his life. The ramp of the landing craft dropped, and Jack and his fellow soldiers charged onto the beach. They were immediately met with a hail of gunfire from the German defenders. Jack and his squad fought their way through the sand, dodging bullets and explosions. They reached a seawall, where they were pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. Jack looked around and saw his comrades falling all around him. He knew that he had to do something, or they would all be killed. He grabbed a grenade and pulled the pin. He waited a few seconds, then threw the grenade over the seawall. There was a deafening explosion, and the machine gun fire stopped. Jack and his squad charged over the seawall and into the German trenches. They fought their way through the trenches, clearing them of German soldiers. Finally, they reached the top of the bluff overlooking the beach. Jack looked out over the battlefield. The beach was littered with the bodies of Allied and German soldiers. The water was red with blood. But the Allies had secured the beachhead. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. Jack took a deep breath and looked around at his surviving squad members. They were all exhausted and covered in blood, but they were alive. They had survived D-Day. The next day, Jack and his squad were given a new mission. They were to advance inland and capture a strategic crossroads. They marched for hours, passing through fields and forests. They were constantly on the lookout for German soldiers, but they encountered no resistance. Finally, they reached the crossroads. It was deserted. Jack and his squad set up a defensive position and waited. They knew that the Germans would eventually counterattack. Sure enough, a few hours later, a large force of German soldiers appeared. The Germans launched a fierce attack, but Jack and his squad held their ground. They fought back with everything they had, and eventually the Germans were forced to retreat. Jack and his squad had successfully defended the crossroads. They had played a small but important role in the liberation of Western Europe. The road to victory. Jack and his squad continued to fight their way through France and into Germany. They saw some of the worst fighting of the war, but they never gave up. Finally, in May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Jack had survived the war, but he had seen too much death and destruction. He was determined to make sure that nothing like this would ever happen again. He returned home a hero, but he was also a changed man. He was more serious and thoughtful, and he had a deep appreciation for life. Jack never forgot the sacrifices that he and his fellow soldiers had made. He dedicated his life to working for peace and understanding. He became a teacher and taught his students about the horrors of war. He also worked with veterans organizations to help them cope with the physical and emotional scars of war. Jack Riley was a true American hero. He fought for his country and for the freedom of Europe. He never gave up, even when the odds were stacked against him. He is an inspiration to us all. Note: this story is based on the real-life experiences of D-Day veterans. The Soldier's Ghost. In the twilight hours of D-Day, Private First Class John Harris huddled in a foxhole, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle was raging all around him, and he knew that his chances of survival were slim. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling his name. "John," the voice whispered. "John, over here." John looked up and saw the figure of a soldier standing in the shadows. The soldier was wearing a torn and bloody uniform, and his face was pale and gaunt. "Who are you?" John asked. "I'm your friend, John," the soldier said. I'm here to help you." John hesitated. He didn't know what to make of the strange soldier. "Come with me," the soldier said. "I'll take you to safety." John reluctantly followed the soldier into the darkness. They walked for what seemed like hours, until they reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, dark house. "This is it," the soldier said. "This is where you'll be safe." John and the soldier entered the house. The door slammed shut behind them, and John was plunged into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light revealed a room filled with strange and disturbing objects. There were old dolls hanging from the ceiling, their eyes staring blankly at John. There were animal bones scattered on the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew that he was in a place of evil. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him. He turned and saw the soldier standing in the doorway. The soldier's face was no longer pale and gaunt. It was now contorted into a hideous mask of rage and hatred. "You're not my friend," John said. "You're a demon." The soldier laughed a cold, cruel laugh. "Yes," he said. "I'm a demon. And I'm here to take you to hell." The soldier lunged at John, and John screamed in terror. He turned and ran, but the demon was faster. It grabbed John by the arm and dragged him to the center of the room. John struggled, but the demon was too strong. It threw John to the ground and raised its claws to strike. Just as the demon was about to deliver the killing blow, John heard a voice calling his name. "John!" The voice shouted. "Wake up, John!" John opened his eyes and saw his squad leader standing over him. "What's wrong?" the squad leader asked. "You were having a nightmare." John sat up, his heart still pounding in his chest. He looked around and saw that he was back in his foxhole. He had been dreaming. But he knew that the dream was a warning. The demon was real, and it was waiting for him. Second soldier story. The cold, pre-dawn air was thick with the salt of the English Channel, biting at the skin with an almost predatory chill. Private James Bennett, a young soldier from a small town in Pennsylvania, huddled among his comrades in the cramped confines of the Higgins landing craft, barreling towards the Normandy coast. The roar of the craft's engine was nearly drowned out by the pounding of his heart, each beat a reminder of the impending chaos. June 6, 1944, would be his first taste of combat, a day that had been etched into the minds of all Allied forces as the beginning of the end of the war. The plan was grandiose and fraught with peril, an amphibious assault on a heavily fortified coastline that Hitler had arrogantly declared impregnable. Yet, here they were, a vast armada of men and machines, poised to challenge that assertion with their very lives. As the coastline drew nearer, the ominous crack of German artillery began to fill the air, a harrowing overture to the ballet of death that awaited them. James's thoughts drifted to his family back home, to his younger brother who looked up to him and his parents who feared for his safety. He clung to their faces in his mind, a beacon of hope in the looming darkness. The landing craft's ramp dropped with a metallic clang, jolting James back to the present. Instantly, the air was filled with the cacophony of gunfire and explosions, the water around them churning with deadly intent. "Move, move, move," shouted the sergeant, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. James plunged into the frigid waters, the shock of the cold momentarily paralyzing. With determination, he willed his limbs to move, pushing through the surf under the weight of his full gear. Around him, men fell, struck down before they could even set foot on the sand. The beach, codenamed Omaha, was a hellscape of machine gun fire, barbed wire, and mines, a gauntlet that seemed impossible to survive. Yet, survive he did. Through sheer grit and a bit of luck, James found himself huddled against the base of a cliff, the relative safety a brief respite from the horror. Around him, the remnants of his unit regrouped, their faces set in grim determination. They were the first wave, the tip of the spear, and their sacrifice had paved the way for those who followed. The battle for Omaha Beach would rage for hours, each minute an eternity of fear and valor. James fought with a bravery he never knew he possessed, driven by the thought of liberation, of ending the tyranny that had engulfed Europe. As the sun began to set on that longest day, the beach was finally secured. The cost had been high, the sand stained with the blood of heroes. Yet, amidst the devastation, there was a sense of triumph. D-Day had succeeded, the first step towards the liberation of Western Europe had been taken. In the days that followed, James would continue to fight across the French countryside, part of the relentless push towards victory. The memories of D-Day would haunt him, a reminder of the fragility of life and the price of freedom. But he would also remember the camaraderie, the moments of unexpected kindness amidst the brutality of war, and the overwhelming sense of purpose that had driven them all. The days became a blur of marching, fighting, and brief, restless periods of respite. Each town liberated brought a mix of joy and sorrow, the faces of grateful civilians mingling with the ever-present shadow of loss. James's unit became his family, a tight-knit group of men from different walks of life, thrown together by fate and bound by a shared purpose. As they pushed further inland, the reality of war settled in. James witnessed acts of incredible bravery, moments of humanity that shone brightly against the backdrop of conflict. He saw the best and worst of what men could be, the complexity of the human condition laid bare by the extremity of their circumstances. Amidst the chaos, James found a kind of clarity, a realization of what truly mattered. One day, in a small village recently liberated, James and his unit were resting, taking stock of their supplies and tending to their wounds. The sound of children playing in the distance was a stark contrast to the constant gunfire they had grown accustomed to. A local woman, her face etched with the fatigue of occupation, approached them with a basket of fresh bread and cheese. Her simple act of kindness, a gesture of thanks, was a poignant reminder of what they were fighting for. The war, however, was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge loomed on the horizon, a last, desperate offensive by the Germans. It was December now, the cold biting deeper than ever. James's unit was among those caught off guard by the German advance, their positions overwhelmed in the early stages of the fight. Surrounded and cut off from supply lines, the situation seemed dire. Yet, the adversity brought out a fierce resolve in the Allied soldiers. James found himself in the role of a makeshift leader, rallying his comrades to hold their ground against the onslaught. For days, they endured under siege conditions, their ammunition dwindling, their hopes sustained by the belief in each other and the cause they served. The tide of the battle turned with the arrival of reinforcements and the breaking of the German lines. It was a hard-won victory, one that came at a great cost. James lost friends in those snowy forests, their sacrifices ingrained in his heart, a weight he would carry long after the war ended. In the spring of 1945, as the Allies made their final push into Germany, the sense of impending victory was tempered by the devastation wrought by years of conflict. James marched through towns that were shadows of their former selves, the scars of war evident in the rubble of buildings and the haunted eyes of survivors. The day of Germany's surrender was one of mixed emotions for James. Relief and joy were overshadowed by grief for those who could not celebrate victory, their lives claimed by the war. Returning home, James was hailed as a hero, yet he felt like a stranger in a world that had moved on without him. The war had changed him, as it had changed the world. He struggled to adjust to civilian life, the memories of battle lingering like ghosts at the edge of his mind. Yet, he found solace in the company of other veterans, men who understood the cost of the peace they had fought for. As the war drew to a close and James attempted to settle back into civilian life, he found that the shadows of his past were not so easily dispelled. The world had changed, and so had he, irrevocably altered by the horrors he had witnessed and the burdens he carried. But it wasn't just the memories that haunted him, something else had followed him home from the battlefields of Europe, something intangible and chilling. It began with the dreams. At first, they were mere echoes of the battlefield, the sounds of gunfire and the cries of the wounded filling his nights. But gradually, they morphed into something darker, more sinister. James found himself wandering through a twisted version of the forests of the Ardennes, the ground slick with something more viscous than mud, the trees whispering secrets in a language he felt he almost understood. In these dreams, he was not alone. Shadows flitted between the trees, shapes that were human and yet not, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They whispered his name, voices like the crackling of fire, pulling him deeper into the forest. And always, there was the sense of something immense watching him, an ancient, malevolent presence that had awoken on the battlefields of Europe, drawn to the carnage and the chaos. James woke from these dreams sweating and screaming, the echoes of the whispers lingering in his ears. He tried to convince himself that it was just the trauma of war, the stress of readjustment to civilian life. But deep down, he knew it was something more. The war had opened a door to something ancient and terrible, and he had brought it back with him. The encounters began to bleed into his waking life. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, disappearing when he turned to look directly at them. Cold spots appeared in his house, the air tinged with the scent of decay. Objects moved on their own, and sometimes he would wake to find marks on his skin, as if something had touched him in his sleep. James sought help, confiding in his fellow veterans, but they had their own demons to fight and could offer no explanation for his. He delved into books on the supernatural, on ancient myths and legends, looking for answers. What he found only served to deepen his fear. Tales of spirits and entities drawn to sites of great suffering and death, feeding on the despair and the agony. He became convinced that he had become the focus of such an entity, a being that had latched onto him amidst the blood-soaked fields of Normandy. In his search for a way to rid himself of this haunting, James stumbled upon a small group of individuals who believed him. They were scholars of the occult, people who walked the line between the seen and the unseen. They spoke of rituals and protections, of ways to banish the entity that clung to him. But they warned him, too, of the dangers. To confront such a being was to risk not just his life but his very soul. Armed with this knowledge, James prepared to face the entity. He gathered the necessary items for the ritual, symbols of protection and wards, and waited for the night when the veil between the worlds was thinnest. The air was electric with a palpable sense of dread as he began the ritual, the candles casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The temperature dropped, breath turning to mist in the air, as he recited the ancient words, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. Then, it appeared. A form coalescing from the shadows, taller and more terrifying than any nightmare he had faced. It spoke in a voice like the grinding of bones, a language that twisted his insides. James held his ground, continuing the ritual, the symbols of protection glowing with a light that seemed to burn the entity. The Battle of Wales was intense, James's voice growing hoarse as he repeated the incantations, the entity looming closer, its presence suffocating. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the entity screamed, a sound that tore at the very fabric of the night, and dissipated, leaving behind a silence so profound it rang in James's ears. Exhausted but triumphant, James collapsed, the first hints of dawn creeping into the sky. The haunting was over, the entity vanished back to whatever darkness it had come from. But the scars it left behind, both physical and mental, would remain with James forever. He had faced the horrors of war, but it was this battle, fought in the silence of his own home, that would define him. He had stared into the abyss, and though he had emerged victorious, the darkness would always linger at the edge of his vision, a reminder of the price of delving into the unknown.